Aloha, my name is Frank Clay. I am curator here at the Battleship Missouri Memorial, and welcome to Sea Stories, where we'll be discussing the experiences of the former crew members of the Mighty Mo online. And today we're honored to be joined by Dean Starovasnik, who served aboard the Missouri during the Gulf War era. Welcome, Dean.
Glad to be here, Frank.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. So if you don't mind introducing yourself, where you came from, and kind of how you joined the Navy.
Sure. Dean Starovasnik, I joined the Navy as a commissioned officer in 1984, having come through the Navy ROTC program at MIT. I had no inclination, frankly, of being in the military other than in high school. I got offers for the opportunity to participate in a competition for a ROTC scholarship. And my dad told me I was going to college either on my own nickel or the taxpayers, not on his. So when the scholarship came through and MIT accepted me, I thought, well, all right, I'll at least try the first 2 years, after which I could, at the time, leave with no obligation. But after joining the ROTC program and getting involved, I found out I really did like the military aspects and enjoyed the opportunity to be of service. Having grown up in the Seattle area, I'd gone to the Missouri as a tourist as a kid. I had at one time a picture of me standing next to a 16-inch shell that was taller than me. But when I got toward the end of my college years, I actually had applied to the nuke power program, was unsuccessful, having failed one course my freshman year at MIT, which apparently was a disqualifier. But as a result, got selected to go to the pre-commissioning unit on the Missouri. I was really excited about that opportunity, of course, given that I'd been there and was familiar with the battleships. Had built a model of the Wisconsin, actually, when I was younger. We lived there. And so getting assigned to Missouri and a pre-commissioning role was quite exciting for a couple of reasons. One, of course, the high profile of Missouri, but the pre-commissioning crew, of course, is somewhat hand-selected, tends to be a little bit better than average from a crew perspective. And so I had the good fortune of being assigned first to the engineering department under Limited Duty Officer Commander Isaiah John Jones, who was our first Chang and had been the MPA on New Jersey. So he kind of took me under his wing and said, you're going to be one of my 5 engineering officers of the watch for the Propulsion Examining Board, which very quickly became a fire hose, and got to the point where I was fairly comfortable with the plant and could successfully pass the Propulsion Examining Board's oral exams and written exams. So great way to get started, with a lot of good mentoring, not only from Commander Jones, but Lieutenant Dan Poehler, my immediate superior, the auxiliaries officer, as well as a host of really seasoned warrants and LDOs, as well as, of course, a number of senior enlisted. So that's a little bit about how I got to Missouri and what was my start there, at least.
Okay. And how many years were you on the Missouri total?
3.5, a little longer than most normal junior officer tours, but the first year pre-commissioning didn't count, quote unquote. So actually had that extra time, which to me was a real advantage. Obviously, I got to know engineering pretty well, and then spent the latter half of my time in Missouri in the missiles officer role, GM division officer first, and then missiles officer. But also, as a result of being on board so long, I was one of the more senior lieutenants. As a result, I got a single stateroom for my last 18 months or so on board, which was a real treat. Even had 2 portholes. So.
Oh, nice. Yeah, 1 porthole is a treat, but 2, you're definitely someone at that point.
Yeah, I was way ahead.
So you came aboard as an ensign, and then you left the Missouri as a senior lieutenant?
Correct. Yep.
Okay. So would you mind walking us through your experience on board, your responsibilities, I guess starting with A gang and then moving on to GM, Div,
Sure.
and missiles officer?
Well, A-gang is most of all the engineering stuff that is not involved in, directly at least, in main propulsion. So it includes air conditioned refrigeration, both in terms of heating and ventilation type concerns, but also, of course, the refrigeration plant and the new ACs that we brought on board, both to cool the crew compartments, but more importantly, a lot of electronic spaces where we had, the Tomahawk weapon systems, the radio systems, and the communication suite, the radar systems, and so forth, which as a result got me throughout the ship because we had equipment everywhere. In addition, that was the hydraulics, so anchor windlass to after steering, all the engines, the diesel engines, so the 2 emergency diesel generators, the ship's boats, captain's gig, all of the hotel equipment, that is laundry, mess cooking equipment. So again, got exposed to a large chunk of the ship, but then I stood watch as engineering officer of the watch, like I mentioned. So I spent my watch standing time in the main propulsion plant. So again, got exposed to basically everything below decks, which was excellent learning opportunity for me. I'm sort of naturally curious by nature. It's why I like the job I have now. I'm always learning new things about new companies. And so for me, it was just an ongoing learning experience. And then as well, I learned an awful lot about leading troops. I had roughly 90 sailors, many of them much older than me. I had some guys who come out of retirement to bring the engineering plant into service again. And so literally had sailors older than my dad, in a couple of cases older than my granddad on board. So a lot of great opportunities for me to learn. In particular, I want to remember Senior Chief Grant, Machinist Mate Senior Chief Grant, who took me under his wing as my leading chief petty officer and basically told me what it took to be successful as a young officer, a lot of which involved listening to him, which was excellent advice. After about almost 2 years in that role, then as many junior officers do, we switched positions, and I went topside to the missiles officer job, or again, GM division officer initially, whose immediate superior was the missiles officer. Ron Ralph left the ship after about 4 or 5 months. It was his time to rotate off, and there was no one to replace him. So I got fleeted up into that role, which again, a great learning opportunity. Had the Tomahawk, Harpoon, and Sea Whiz weapon systems, and as well the responsibility of preparing the ship for Tomahawk weapons inspection, for nuclear weapons acceptance inspection, which certified the ship to carry such weapons. So a ton of responsibility, but again, really great sailors around me and other officers around me to help keep me out of trouble and help me learn the role as needed. In that case, I stood watch as what's called the Alpha Sierra Watch Standard, the anti-surface warfare commander's watch standard. So our ship normally, if we were in a battle group, was the anti-surface warfare commander, because of course we had the Tomahawk and Harpoon, but also the big main battery, great anti-surface weapons. And so obviously the skipper doesn't stand watch, so I was one of those who would stand that watch position, which again forced me to learn about the air-based assets we had to support search, the national assets, the Black World stuff to support the intel gathering for the anti-surface picture. So another great learning opportunity to give me a good grounding on the upper portion of the ship, both in age, newer stuff, and in terms of actually being topside for more than just a breath of fresh air.
Yeah. So would you mind explaining to us what was life like on board in the wardroom as a junior officer on the USS Missouri?
Sure. It was really as good as it could be, potentially. I mentioned I'd wanted to be in the submarine force, the nuclear power Navy, and I'd done my first class midi cruise on a Sturgeon class submarine. And, those guys were working awfully hard. They were really concerned about qualifying in terms of engineering officer, qualifying for the Dolphins. And it was just a lot of pressure. And I'm not saying it wasn't pressurized and sometimes challenging in Missouri, but it was a whole lot more fun. We had a fairly sizable wardroom, anywhere from 60 to 80 officers, depending on what was going on. A lot of them, again, LDOs and warrants to school us young JOs. But then also a number of other JOs to hang with and to kind of compare notes and help each other get through qualifications, whether it was EOW or eventually getting my surface warfare pin. So I really enjoyed it. I actually served as mess treasurer for a while because the officers pay for their own food, much of which was bought from the crew's mess. But we, the chief petty officer, who is our senior cook, would go ashore and solicit great food options from the local markets. I remember him coming back from when we were in the Philippines with, just hundreds of pounds of fresh shrimp, which served as part of the main menu for our various and sundry receptions we had as we traveled around the world. But it really was enjoyable. Again, there was serious work to be done, and the senior officers were always there to keep us in line, but also to help us grow as we were beginning our careers.
And I plan on asking this question to all of our sea story interviews, but how was the chow for you?
Well, the wardroom does get a little bit better cut. Obviously, that's in part because we're paying for it. But the chow on board in general, and I ate back in the cruise mess on a regular basis, in part because my troops, particularly when I was in A gang, were responsible for maintaining that equipment. And so it was actually kind of one of the benefits, because the cooks knew if I was happy and my troops were down there keeping their stuff working, their jobs were easier. So I could always count on getting a good snack or a nice meal if I needed to off watch, and the wardroom wasn't serving at the time. So chow on the mess decks was great, and then wardroom, really very good, maybe a touch better, if not for no other reason, but it's really nice to have someone bring you your food. So of course we only ate in about 3-minute buckets because we were very busy, particularly underway. And so you'd sit down, grab chow, eat, and get going. And frankly, if you hung around, chit-chatted too long, some senior officer would be like, "Don't you have some qualifications to work on or something?" So it was a quick experience in most cases.
Right on. All right, so we're going to kind of move on to the sea stories and the scuttlebutt portion of this interview. And we talked last week, and I guess I just want to start with talk about the Tomahawk missiles and the TLAM-D variants that you
Sure.
guys launched. And for those of you who don't know, the TLAM-D variant of the Tomahawk was the ones armed with cluster munitions, and Dean was in charge of firing, oversaw one of the firing of one of these missiles during a test fire, correct?
Yeah, so the TLAM-D, of course, is a cruise missile. It's guided primarily by a terrain following mapping program, as well as the terminal portion of the flight, an optical system that looks at the ground below it and compares it to pictures it's stored to make sure it's on track. So it's very accurate. I mean, you could literally pick the window in the building you wanted the missile to fly into. But in the TLAM-D variant, you carried aboard the missile sub-munitions, bomblets, that could be dropped at various areas, not all at once necessarily. So you could, in theory, one of the mission profiles was to run down the runway, dropping bomblets to crater the runway, making it unusable, and then fly the missile into the tower or the hangar or whatever, and let the unburned fuel become the remaining explosive. So at the time, though, this was later in my time in Missouri, of course, as I was in the missiles role, we were test firing those for the first time. And so Missouri was tasked with taking 2 missiles aboard and test firing them into China Lake. So that means you're flying over I-5 and assorted other, populated areas. So that always necessitates a chase plane with the ability to shoot the missile down should anything go sideways. So all that said, backing up to taking those missiles on board, of course, one of my first major responsibilities in the missiles officer role was that unload of those missiles. So we're all down there. We got all the programs and the charts and stuff out to do everything just right. And we've got the shipyard with the cranes bringing the missiles aboard. We got the first missile on, got it in the armored box launcher, the ABL, all fine, no issues. Second one, we're coming up and the crane breaks while we're in motion. It doesn't fall, thankfully, but it just stops. And the shipyard workers cannot get the crane operating. Now, it was at the end of the day, and of course, the yard workers are unionized. They go off watch at a particular time, and again, the crane was still inoperative. So we actually had to leave the missile suspended from the crane overnight. So I'm going home to my apartment there in San Pedro thinking, this is not good, but wasn't much I could do about it. And of course, everyone knew, the weapons officer knew, we told everyone we could what was going on, and they all agreed there's nothing to do but just wait and come back the next morning. So next morning, I'm driving across Vincent Thomas Bridge, heading toward the ship, and I can see the ship pretty well from the top of the bridge, and there's no missile suspended over the ship. So now I know my career is over because we've lost a missile somehow. Well, as it turns out, got back to the ship, the duty watch, the weapons duty watch had actually been contacted by the shipyard. Crane workers came in real early. They got it operating and they got the missile on board and loaded, all without me being there. So, wiped the sweat off my brow. Okay, thankfully that got done properly. Of course, this is all before cell phone, so no one was calling saying, hey, we're going to move your missile. Didn't find out until I was on the bridge, and then I thought it was a bad thing. So all that said, we head out to sea, we get ready to do the test firing, and we're ready to launch the first missile. I'm standing the missile officer role, so I'm not touching any buttons. I'm just directing the sailors who are doing the heavy lifting. And we order the launch of the first missile, and the launch control operator, Brian Hardish, FC2 at the time, turns to me and says, hang fire, no response. So, we've done our practice. We knew what to do. All right, abort. He shuts down the launch. We stop the firing because to be careful to ensure that the missile is safe as it flies over populated areas, there's a chase plane, like I mentioned, and the chase plane in this case is being flown by Vice Admiral Kahune. And so the idea was that he was to come up right behind the missile as it came up out of the tube and could follow it in that. Well, obviously you don't want the plane ahead of the missile. That's a bad thing. So aborting and doing so in a timely manner was really important. So my first thought after the smoke cleared from that was, oh no, that was the missile that was hanging in the air. Somebody irradiated it with a fire control radar or whatever over the night. Someone testing out some equipment in the shipyard there, and we scrambled some electrons and the electronics inside. Fortunately, next try, same missile, and we aren't sure it was the missile that was suspended, by the way. Fire successfully, no issues, chase it in. Follow up with the second test firing, fire successfully, all things are fine. Of course, we never got the report of how the other end of the experience went. We didn't get the BDA or whatever, the test results, that's all classified, but at least got off the ground, and at least to our knowledge, never had to be destroyed en route. So 2 successful test launches. Interestingly, by the way, the lead officer from the test and evaluation group from the Secretary of Defense's office was our former operations officer, Commander Rausch, Rausch. And so he was there on his old ship, and we all knew him to be pretty tough, but he was pleased with the results. So we thought we got away happy on that one.
Overall, missile went away successfully, test was accomplished, and you probably blew up a bunch of stuff downrange, but you didn't know.
We would hope so, yeah. I think if there had been problems, we would have heard. Since we didn't hear anything, we can only assume it went well. And
do you know if that was the first time the TLMD was tested from a ship, or?
Yeah, to our knowledge, that was the first ship-based launch of the TLMDs. Of course, they've been tested previously in other methods, and certainly the first ever from a battleship. Not in anger, but from all, everything we could see from our end of it, aside from the extra bodies in the CEC, it was a pretty normal, just like it would be in a wartime experience.
All right. Well, thank you for sharing that story. I kind of want to move on to the engineering aspect of it too. And you had mentioned that there was a casualty in #1 engine room once you got underway. Would you mind kind of telling us a little bit about that story?
Yeah. Shortly after we got commissioned, so we got commissioned in May, and then August, we began a world cruise that was to basically replicate the Great White Fleet's world cruise back in pre-World War I era. And our first stop was actually not a stop. We were to sail by Molokai in honor of Father Damien, who started the colony there. And so we were to make that pass, bringing aboard the leader of the colony at present, but not stopping in Pearl. So first night out of Long Beach, I had the watch as engineer officer of the watch, down below decks. We were making 20 knots. We had a pretty aggressive schedule. We were to be in Australia, in Sydney, for the Royal Australian Navy's 75th anniversary. And obviously that had a very fixed window to it, and we wanted to be there to support that event. So we're maybe an hour underway on off-sea and anchor detail on normal watch. And I was standing in my watch in what was an open main control. There's no booth there at the time, and we hear something that's loud, unusual, rumbling sort of a sound, a little bit like a freight train. Now, to be clear, in the engineering spaces on a World War II battleship, it sounds pretty loud regardless. So we're all wearing muffs and everything. So the fact that this comes through above the background noise is concerning. So I was just reaching for the 5MC microphone, which allows me to speak to all the main spaces and say, all spaces main control. What was that, basically? And as I'm about to key the mic, I hear #1 main engine room come on and say, main control, #1 main engine, loud metallic noise, #1 main engine, stopping and locking, #1 main engine, which means basically we're trying to stop this shaft that's driving, quarter of the horsepower, pushing this 57,000-ton battleship through the water at 20 knots. Which makes my first action then to call the bridge, saying we are going to emergency 2/3. So bridge main control, #1 main engine, loud metallic noise, stopping locking #1 main engine, emergency 2/3, which means we're going to 10 knots so that they have the ability to stop that propeller and not have to fight as much of the drag of the water going past it at 20 knots. So come to find out that a chunk of one of the teeth in the bull gear, sorry, one of the pinion gears, I got this wrong before too, the pinions that drive the bull gear, I want to say a 12-foot in diameter gear that drives the shaft, memory's fading a little bit, monster gear. One of the teeth of the pinion had broken off and traversed across the bull gear, creating a huge gouge in all those teeth. That was the noise, the rumbling was that gearing interacting against that misshapen space. So of course, stopping line is the first best thing you can do because it prevents any further damage. But now we've got to deal with this. So we, of course, 3 seconds after I talked to the bridge, I'm talking to the chief engineer to let him know what's going on. And another 4 seconds later, he was down there. So he's got the keys. He takes the keys and we go open up number 1 main engine, uncover the damage, and actually begin the repairs en route with the machinery repairmen that were in A gang. They had the ability to create these tools, to machine the tools that we would then use to smooth the grooves and the lands. And some of the most senior machinist mates and machinery repairmen got in there and started working on it. We picked up a couple of GE technician reps. GE was the manufacturer of the engines in Pearl. We didn't get to pull in, of course, darn. They just heal it out, but they came aboard and they assisted in the repairs as we made our way down to Sydney. And then once we got to Sydney, had finished the repairs, buttoned it up, they ran audio tests on it. It turned out to be the quietest engine of the 4 now, but obviously a very successful repair while we're underway. You'd think the tech reps are enjoying the fact that they get to fly out to Honolulu, get to ride a ship all the way down to Sydney, enjoy some time in Australia. But of course, the path of our transit took us right near the crossing of the equator and the international date line. So of course, we had a shellback initiation, in this case, a golden shellback initiation in the traditional old Navy way of doing a shellback initiation, unlike today's world. So those tech reps got to go through that as well. And it was actually not as bad as it could have been, because of the 1,600 sailors on board, only 400 were shellbacks. The other 1,200 were WOGs, including the XO, Captain Fahey. So he had to go through it, but there weren't that many shellbacks, so there maybe wasn't quite as few blows from the shillelaghs as there might have been otherwise had the numbers been reversed. And we did make another crossing later when we went back during the Gulf War, or during the Iran-Iraq War, during the Ernest Will ops. And of course, at that point now, there's like 1,450 shellbacks and 150 WOGs. So the skipper had to put out the word, look, we can't kill them, all right? So we've got to dial back the effort because there's way too many shellbacks. But all that to say, it was a great transit. We made the scheduled arrival. We did a great gun shoot off of Sydney. Some pictures I'm sure are available on the website that show those gun shoots photographed by the Sydney press, and then had an outstanding visit in Sydney as a result. But I can't claim it was anything that I had much to do with, but it was nice to at least have the responsibility to immediately address a real casualty. But number 1 main engine sailors were the ones who really, saved the day and kept the engine from eating itself.
So you folks transited the Pacific from Hawaii to Australia on 3 engines.
Correct. We broke the shaft, number 1 shaft, so that it would pinwheel the prop, so we didn't act as a big parachute. That saved a fair bit of gas, and actually, it's a more efficient way for the ship to sail. It's just really cumbersome to break the shaft, so it's not something you can turn on and off if you wish. But yeah, we transited on the other 3, made it easier on the watch standards as well, because aside from the gas turbine, the steam turbines in number 1 that provide electricity, we didn't have to staff the engine itself.
And those 400 shellbacks, the arms must have been pretty tired by the end of that initiation, huh?
As I say, a lot of shillelagh swinging, but so many targets, it made it easier on us because not so many shillelaghs to hit us.
I wonder if a tennis elbow from all the shillelagh swinging accounts for disability.
That was probably one of the least of their concerns at that time.
But do you mind sharing a little bit about the World Cruise? That was a pretty historic event that you're a part of.
Yeah, it really was. And, in large measure, it was a global shopping expedition for us because we got back right before Christmas. So we enjoyed, sheepskins and opals in Australia. gold and alabaster and so forth, and turkey, the curios and palma. I think I got all of at least some of those to bring back to friends and family. So it was, and like as I mentioned, there was a reception in pretty much every port. So all the dignitaries come aboard. Of course, the officers were naturally part of that. Got to enjoy some fun conversations, meeting some really interesting people. I remember having Christmas Eve dinner. Actually, the night before Christmas Eve dinner at the Consul General's house in Sydney, which was quite an experience. Formal dinner. The skipper, the XO, and a handful of us JOs got invited. Had to have a blazer because that was the attire required, which there's a story there if we want to cover that. But got to meet some really nice local folks there in Australia, some of the more senior people, and enjoy a pleasant meal and get a little bit of the tradition. One of the families I met, I went and actually joined them for Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. I remember vividly playing soccer. I played soccer in high school and college with these guys who were all much more fit than I was. Of course, I was chained to a ship, so I didn't get a lot of running in. And by the way, it was like 85 degrees at Christmas because we're down under. But had an excellent time with the locals that I never would have had I not at least been able to enjoy that dinner at the Consul General's house.
And if you don't mind sharing the blazer story, you told us that earlier, but I think it's just a great story if you don't mind sharing it.
Sure. Yeah. As a JO, I didn't really know that was a good idea, but I figured, well, I better bring a suit along just in case. Of course, I had my uniform, but there are a lot of events that occurred, particularly with the officers, where a uniform wasn't necessarily appropriate. And so that was one of them. And that all rolls up to later, as I was, last few months of my time on Missouri, this young goofy ensign comes aboard, Tim White. And Tim is actually assigned as a GM division officer because I was covering both roles, even though he hadn't gone through missile school yet, which he had to do. But while I was aboard, I said, Tim, it's a good idea just to make sure you always have a blue blazer in your closet. You never know when an opportunity may come up. And I, not only the Consul General in Sydney, but the Deputy Commander of the Iberian Peninsula NATO role for a 3-star admiral had a similar reception. Now we're talking about Thanksgiving when we were in Lisbon, Portugal. And I got to go along with the skipper and a few of the other officers, again, because I at least had the right uniform, the civilian attire that I could wear there. And so I just encouraged him to make sure he had that before he got underway. Come to find out as we're visiting Missouri back in 2016 for the 30th reunion, 30th anniversary of her commissioning. Tim is our guest speaker, but now he's an admiral. And I'd forgotten, of course, about the blue blazer story, but Tim mentions to me, he said, Dean, the one piece of advice you gave me, of course, all this tactical stuff, all the leadership stuff, he didn't remember any of that. He did remember that I had suggested he get the blue blazer, and he said that I don't know how much that mattered, but it did help me in my career get associated with more senior leaders and get to learn from them a little more. And obviously he got a star. I think he ended up with 2 stars before he retired. But yeah, so it paid off. I'll take a little bit of credit for Tim's success.
So the blue blazer was the key for advancement.
Key might be a bit strong, but it helped maybe a little bit.
Oh, good. All right. Well, is there anything else you'd like to share with us about sea stories aboard ship?
Well, the one thing that I didn't mention last time that I thought was kind of interesting, if you will, of course, the broadside pictures get a lot of attention, and they continue to be a subject of discussion in today's world as people see the pictures and they, oh, how far does the ship move sideways? Oh, you couldn't be on deck when those were going off because, of course, they blow your eardrums out and scramble your innards, and all these sea stories about that. For the most part, all of which is not true. And so my first experience with a gun shoot above decks, because I've been below decks quite a number of times, and the key for us below decks is in the main spaces in particular, of course, they're not air conditioned, so they're very hot. You're standing underneath normally as much as possible a vent that's constantly blowing fresh air on you. But when the main battery was fired, you could hear the buzz, and then the third buzz was also the pull of the trigger to fire the gun. You take one step sideways because all this dirt and crust that was up in the vents would come flowing out, particularly early in our time after commissioning. And so you'd want to get out of the way of that. And of course, you'd always watch the newbies because they didn't know, get showered with the dust and then laugh at them. We're young guys. We don't know civility. So I had not experienced that until at one point we were off of the SoCal op area. I forget exactly where. I think there's a range on Catalina we actually were using at the time. And I wasn't on watch, so I run up to the bridge. I was still in my overalls because we could wear those on watch down in engineering, not really appropriate bridge attire. But my buddies were up there on watch, so they didn't mind. So I'm like, all right, to go up and watch the gun shoot finally up on deck. And so I was up on the bridge, 04 level. Of course, the windows roll down, which is important because the overpressure would crack the windows, and we didn't want that. And so I'm up there, and of course, gun shoots are like, hours of positioning and prep and training and practice, and then, a millisecond of a gun shoot, and then you're another hour of waiting. So we're hanging around chit-chatting and stuff, and then they say, all right, we're gonna get ready, and they pass the word, stand by for main battery firing. And so we're, kind of looking around, and I noticed that my buddies from the wardroom are all drifting back around behind the Citadel. Of course, we're set up for a starboard broadside, which is kind of our standard. And I'm standing right there on the starboard side of the 04 bridge wing, looking out at turret 2, which I can about touch when it's in that firing on the beam position. And buzz, and then the guns go off. And I had really kind of a mixed experience. There's a part of me that, as the wash of heat from the fireball hit me before the pressure wave, as that hit me, I started thinking, I need to get out of here. And then the pressure wave hit me and blew me up against the Citadel, and I couldn't get out of there. And then the third experience was the little boy inside of me going, oh, let's do that again. It was, it's a really remarkable experience. It doesn't scramble your innards. Of course, I had double hearing protection on. My ears were fine. But it was dramatic, to say the least, and an awful lot of fun. And something I say all the time is the only difference between men and boys is the price and size of their toys. And the Navy gave us some of the best toys, the biggest toys you can imagine, particularly when you consider a battleship and all she has to offer.
Right. So for subsequent gunfire, did you warn the next guys, or did you let them find out the hard way like you did?
No, you always let them find out for themselves.
Okay.
And I did have the watch up on the bridge for a few gun shoots after that, and I did walk around behind the Citadel just because after you've experienced it once or twice, okay, fine, it's interesting, but it does get a little bit tiresome actually. But it is pretty darn impressive. In fact, the desktop of my laptop, I can see it in the background, is one of those gun shoots with the shell still in the frame and the big fireballs and all that.
Awesome. All right. Well, so just to wrap things up, do you have any final thoughts on looking back on your career in the U.S. Navy? Do you have any final thoughts on your service?
Sure. Well, of course, in today's world, a lot of folks are real quick to say thank you for your service, and I appreciate that. You're welcome if that's all I have time to say. But if I have a moment, I might say something to the effect of, look, the Navy was responsible for me getting 2 degrees, my undergraduate degree at MIT and a graduate degree at the Navy Postgraduate School. Met my wife and had both our kids while we were in the Navy. Literally sailed around the world on the Missouri, and no one ever shot at me. So I came out way ahead, compared to a lot of my brothers and sisters in arms. Had a much more difficult road to hoe than I did. But it also prepared me for a life in the civilian community where I can take a leadership role, I can be responsible for others' results, and don't feel at all concerned about that, having absorbed that leadership lessons that the Navy provides. And so I really benefited. I think I'm a lot better person than I was. I'm a lot more capable of understanding how to get people to move in a particular direction, as well as recognizing when they're having challenges. Because, day in, day out, I was responsible for dozens of young sailors who needed that guidance and needed someone to look out for them. And I learned, again, a lot of that from the senior enlisteds who had that responsibility directly.
All right. And do you have any message for the fans or followers of the Battleship Missouri watching?
Well, if you haven't been there, obviously you need to go. You need to go for a lot of reasons, not just the Missouri, as important as she is, but most importantly, to understand the level of sacrifice that has been necessary at times in the past for our country to preserve its freedoms and its opportunities for its citizens. And so I think a tour of Pearl Harbor and all that that entails is certainly warranted. We were just there this past summer. Frank was a great host, by the way. Thank you very much for that. We brought our daughters-in-law who had never been to Pearl and had never visited Missouri, but now as members of our family, they knew it was an important part of me. I mean, heck, she's right over there in my shelf in my office. And so they wanted to see, what all the hoopla was about, and they were quite pleased with the results. They were impressed with the condition of Missouri and obviously what she was capable of. So she's an important part, and all that surrounds her is an important part of our history. And I think it's incumbent on us as citizens to try to make that a part of our lives, if that's at all possible. And then, in today's world, of course, we have such things as the web, and we can see an awful lot of that without visiting. It's just not the same.
All right, well, sir, thank you very much for sharing your sea stories with us, and thank you very much for your service.
Absolutely, it was my pleasure.
If anyone would like to support the USS Missouri, you can visit us at our website, ussmissouri.org.